When I asked what time my son's funeral would be, my daughter-in-law replied, "He's long gone. You don't need to worry about it." That was her way of saying I wasn't invited, not to the service, not to the goodbye, not even to the memory. What Savannah didn't know was that Daryl had left me everything, quietly. So I didn't scream. I smiled and said, "Then you don't need to worry either, sweetheart. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from. Because this one's for every mother who got erased and came back. My name is Eunice Harland. I'm 71, and for the first time in my life I know what grief tastes like. Not the loud kind, not the kind people bring casseroles for, but the silent, invisible kind, the kind you feel when someone dies and no one thinks to tell you." The call came at 9:12 a.m. I was folding my son's old flannel shirt, still smelled like pine and aftershave, when my hand brushed the phone. I'd tried calling the hospital 3 times that week. Each time, they said he was resting. Each time I swallowed it. But that morning I dialed Savannah directly, just to ask, "What time is the funeral?" She laughed. Actually laughed, then said those words, "Has long gone?" When I asked what time my son's funeral would be, my daughter-in-law replied, "He's long gone. You don't need to worry about it." That was her way of saying I wasn't invited. Not to the service. Not to the goodbye. Not even to the memory. What Savannah didn't know was that Daryl had left me everything, quietly. So I didn't scream. I smiled and said, "Then you don't need to worry either, sweetheart. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from. Because this one's for every mother who got erased and came back. My name is Eunice Harland. I'm 71, and for the first time in my life I know what grief tastes like. Not the loud kind, not the kind people bring casseroles for, but the silent, invisible kind. The kind you feel when someone dies and no one thinks to tell you." The call came at 9:12 a.m. I was folding my son's old flannel shirt, still smelled like pine and aftershave, when my hand brushed the phone. I'd tried calling the hospital 3 times that week. Each time, they said he was resting. Each time I swallowed it. But that morning I dialed Savannah directly, just to ask, "What time is the funeral?" Actually laughed, then said those words, "Has long gone." I didn't cry. Not then. Not while the pie in the oven burned to a crisp. Not while the smoke curled up into the ceiling vent. Not even when I opened the envelope the next day. A hospital bill, dated 5 days earlier. March 3rd, time of death 2017, AMZEX authorized by Savannah Harland Isverslar's disposition. Cremation, no viewing, no family presence at no family. Was I not family anymore? I stared at the checkbox near the bottom. Next of kin notified. Yes key marked in blue ink. Lees. Clean, neat, government-approved lies. I sat down on the kitchen floor, tile cold against my knees. The silence stretched long and mean. The refrigerator buzzed. Outside, a crow landed on the fence. It stared at me through the window like it knew. I thought about Daryl's last summer at the cabin. How he stood barefoot in the river, fishing rod in one hand, coffee thermos in the other. How he laughed when I slipped on moss. How he said, "You're the toughest old broad I know, Mom." That was 2 years ago, before Savannah started managing everything, his schedule, his diet, his doctors. She always said she was helping, but helping doesn't mean hiding things. Helping doesn't mean locking me out of my own son's dying days. I opened the junk drawer and pulled out my old address book. Pages yellowed. My fingers paused over his name, a first Daryl Harland's. I had written it in black ink, then traced over it again and again until the paper thinned. I flipped to the back. One entry caught my eye. And Matheson Law Office, Chattanooga. That name, he had mentioned it, briefly. Said something like, "They helped me set up some stuff, just in case." I never pressed. Now I regretted that. I grabbed my phone, typed in the number. Voice message, Matheson Law? Please leave your name and number? I hung up. No message. Not yet. I stood slowly. My knees popped. I took the hospital letter and placed it under the magnet on the fridge, next to the last photo I had of Daryl, smiling, holding a fish, sunlight in his eyes. If Savannah signed everything, if I was never told, if the world just moved on without me, then who gave her the right? The last time I saw my son truly happy, he was barefoot in the river behind the old cabin. It was mid-July, the kind of Tennessee summer that presses on your shoulders like wet cotton. The air smelled like honeysuckle and wet wood. The water ran fast over the rocks, cool, whispering clear. Daryl had rolled up his jeans and waded in without hesitation. "Bet I catch more than you," he grinned. casting his line with the confidence of a boy who never grew out of his childhood summers. I sat on the porch steps, coffee cup sweating in my hand, watching him through the morning mist. His hair was damp, his shirt was inside out, and he looked free. That trip wasn't planned. He'd shown up at my door late the night before, Savannah trailing behind him, already on her phone. He said they were passing through, but I could tell he needed space. The kind you only get where no one else is watching. The first morning, I made biscuits from scratch. Savannah didn't come downstairs. She said she had work calls. Daryl and I ate them hot with blackberry jam, like we used to. He asked if the river still flooded in the spring. I said it did. Then he said something that stuck with me. This place, it's the only thing that ever stayed the same. He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a wish, like he was trying to remember who he was before everything got so complicated. We spent the afternoon sanding the old porch rail. He told me his back ached sometimes, said Savannah wanted him to switch doctors, said he was tired a lot, but never went into details. At one point, I caught him staring off toward the woods. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded, then shrugged. "Yeah, just thinking. About stuff?" And then he smiled, the kind of smile that only lasts a second, but tells you everything you need to know. That night, we lit the fire pit. I wrapped an old quilt around my legs. He brought out marshmallows and didn't burn a single one. For a few hours, he wasn't a husband or a patient or a file on someone's desk. He was just my son, just Daryl. And I didn't know it then, but that would be the last time I heard him laugh without effort. The second day, Savannah finally came out of the bedroom. Hair tied tight, face glowing from some kind of screen light. She barely glanced at the river, even as it shimmered in the morning sun. "Could you make the eggs without butter?" she asked. "Daryl's trying to avoid cholesterol." I raised an eyebrow. He always loved butter, said it reminded him of his dad. She didn't respond, just slid her phone back in front of her face and kept scrolling. At breakfast, Daryl ate in silence, barely touched his plate. When I asked if he wanted to take the canoe out like we used to, Savannah cut in. "We have to head back early tomorrow. Daryl has labs on Monday." She said it like a schedule, like a deadline, not like someone talking about her husband's body. That evening, I found Daryl sitting alone by the old tool shed, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes soft with something I couldn't read. "You sure you're okay?" I asked again. He looked up, then forced a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Just tired, you know. Life stuff." But his eyes didn't match the words. I wanted to say more, ask more, hold his hand like I did when he was 10 and afraid of thunder. But he'd already stood up, patted the bench beside him like it held ghosts, and walked back toward the house. Later, Savannah packed while he napped. I watched from the hallway. Her hands moved fast, folding his clothes, tucking away medicine bottles, writing something in her planner. She didn't cry. She didn't pause. She didn't once look at the porch. When they pulled away the next morning, Daryl rolled the window down. "Thanks for letting us crash, Mom," he called out. His voice was light, but his eyes held a goodbye I didn't understand then. I stood on the gravel driveway long after their car turned out of sight. The trees swayed gently. A red bird landed on the porch rail, right where he'd been sanding. I remember walking back inside and seeing the quilt still draped over the armchair. One mug half full. One chair still warm. The other, cold. And I thought to myself, maybe he's been leaving me in pieces. One visit at a time. The first time she said it, I thought I'd misheard. "You're not legally family anymore?" Eunice. Savannah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words hit harder because she whispered them, sharp and precise, like a needle to the heart. I was standing on her porch. White columns, brick steps, a potted fern drooping on the edge. I'd driven over with a tin of lemon bars, the kind Daryl always loved, still warm from the oven. I hadn't seen her since the call. Hadn't even planned to stop by. But something in me refused to accept silence as a proper end. So I knocked. Savannah opened the door halfway. I smiled. "Hi, I made these. Thought maybe we could talk." She didn't move to take them. Instead, her eyes scanned me like I was a solicitor. "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's appropriate. I just want to know. Why didn't anyone call me when he passed? Why wasn't I told?" She crossed her arms. "Because you weren't listed. Daryl handled everything with me. It was his decision? That doesn't sound like him." Her lip curled. "He was sick. He didn't want extra stress." I took a step forward. The tin shook slightly in my hands. "I'm his mother, Savannah." She exhaled through her nose. you were. But there's a difference between blood and binding legal roles. I was his wife. You were not next of kin. The word were felt like a slap, like I'd been demoted from mother to memory. And the funeral, the cremation, the will, all settled, she said. And frankly, showing up like this? It's disruptive. The tin grew heavier. I wanted to throw it at the porch, watch powdered sugar explode across the bricks. But I didn't. I placed it gently on the step. Well, I said quietly, I hope you enjoy them. She didn't say thank you, just shut the door, not a slam, just final. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the lock click. The same way you might listen to a memory closing. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel, fingernails digging crescents into the leather. It wasn't just about lemon bars, or even the funeral. It was about something bigger. About the way Savannah spoke like she'd rewritten history, like Daryl had never had a mother, like love could be edited out of a document. I turned the ignition. The car sputtered, then settled. Before pulling away, I looked back at the tin, still sitting there, untouched. Just like me. Maybe Daryl had been too tired to fight. But I wasn't. The drive home felt longer than it was. I passed familiar fields, the roadside diner with the tilted E, the church with the rusted bell. Everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same in it anymore. When I stepped into my kitchen, the house met me with silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that makes your ears ache. I placed my keys in the bowl, then paused. The tin of lemon bars never left Savannah's porch. Still warm, probably melted now. Like the part of me that thought maybe, just maybe, we could be civil. I poured a glass of water and sat at the table. The wood had a faint scratch where Daryl once carved a tic-tac-toe grid when he was 7. My fingers found it without looking. I thought about her words again. You were his mother. Sie were. As if mothering ended when legal documents changed. As if 38 hours of labor and 38 years of love could be signed away. I opened the drawer near the fridge, the one I hadn't touched in months. Inside old bank receipts, expired coupons, and a stack of envelopes. I thumbed through them absent-mindedly until one stopped me. It was cream-colored, no return address, handwritten. Harlan's in the corner. It was dated nearly 2 years ago. I opened it slowly. Just in case. It started. S. Want you to know where the cabin keys are. I told Savannah I'd added you to the paperwork, but I don't know if she'll honor it if anything ever happens. Matheson Law in Chattanooga has my file. My breath caught. I reread it twice. The ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste or hesitation. The cabin, the one place he felt himself, the one place he might have tried to preserve, quietly, for me. I picked up the letter, walked it to the kitchen window, held it up to the light like scripture. Just then, the phone rang. A known number. I let it go to voicemail, heart pounding. But something nudged me, an instinct I hadn't trusted in a while. I hit redial. A calm voice answered. Hello, this is Erica from Matheson Law. We have you listed as a secondary contact for Mr. Daryl Harland. I've been trying to reach you. I steadied myself against the counter. Yes, I whispered. This is his mother. Do you have a moment? She asked. I have a lot more than that, I said. The office was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in tone, polished floors, brushed metal lamps, a receptionist who smiled without reaching her eyes. Mrs. Harland. A voice called gently. A woman in her 40s, neat blazer, soft voice, approached with a folder pressed to her chest. I'm Erica. Thank you for coming on such short notice. She led me down a narrow hall to a conference room with a view of the river. The blinds were half closed, letting slivers of light cut across the table. We keep a client archive here, she said, settling into the chair across from me. Mr. Harland left us a file labeled for review in the event of medical decline. The medical decline. The words felt like ice on my skin. She opened the folder, flipped through tabs, then paused. There were several documents updated over a 3-year period. Powers of attorney, medical directives, property transfers. My fingers tightened around my purse. What about the cabin? Erica nodded. There's a deed here. It was originally titled under Daryl Harland solely, but it was retitled jointly 2 years ago. To me, I asked, hope rising. No, she said gently. To Savannah Harland? The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table. He promised. In that letter, he said I'd been added. There's no amendment listing you, I'm afraid, she continued. I did find a draft, well, that includes your name, but it was never finalized. I swallowed hard. A draft? Yes, it left the cabin and a small account to you. But it's unsigned. The final version on file named Savannah as sole beneficiary. I couldn't speak. The blinds clicked softly as the air conditioner kicked on. Somewhere outside, a gull called, sharp and far away. Was there any reason he wouldn't have signed the update? I managed. Erica looked hesitant. According to our notes, there was a scheduled review meeting last February, but Mr. Harlan canceled. He said his wife preferred they consolidate assets. My stomach turned. I imagined her standing behind him, hand on his shoulder, smile tight. Let's keep it simple, darling. No loose ends. He'd always been trusting, too trusting. And now he was gone, and everything he'd meant to protect had been left open or rewritten. I took a breath. Can I get copies of those documents? I asked. She nodded. I'll print them all. You deserve to see everything for yourself. I laid the papers across my kitchen table one by one. Each sheet felt heavier than the last. Property transfer. Durable power of attorney. Finalized will. Witness signatures. All neat, all official, but none of them felt like Daryl. The sun had gone down by the time I reached the cabin deed. It was dated the February 12th. The same week he was admitted to the hospital for his last round of treatments. I traced the date with my finger, to 2 days before he stopped responding to my calls. That same morning, I'd left a message, told him I missed his voice. He never called back. I unfolded the page fully and found the signature. Daryl T. Harlan, but something was off. The curve of the H looked wrong, too sharp, too rushed. Daryl always looped his H's with a left-hand flourish. He'd been teased for it in school. I walked to the hallway, and opened the drawer beneath the mirror, pulled out an old birthday card. X. Love you, Mom. Daryl, I brought it back to the kitchen, held it beside the deed. Same name, different hands. The T in his middle initial had always looked like a cross with a long tail. Here it was stiff, mechanical. I sat down hard. Chair legs creaked. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room. Could it have been forged? Or had someone guided his hand? There was another document I hadn't looked at closely yet. The medical directive. Savannah's signature was on every page. Her name printed, her handwriting bold and clean. Mine didn't appear anywhere. I hadn't even been notified. They'd erased me from the legal story of his death. But they couldn't erase the truth. Not all of it. I opened a fresh notebook, wrote down everything. A 1 cabin deed signed 2 Hall to 12 hospital records. Needed signature mismatch, compare with old checks. A final will no witness names I recognize. A Matheson file only has her contact listed. I stared at the list. This wasn't grief. Not anymore. This was something else? I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Marjorie? I said when the line picked up. It's Eunice. You still work records over at St. Luke's? She laughed gently. 20 years and counting? You okay, hon? No, I said. But I'm finally ready to ask the right questions. St. Luke's hadn't changed much. Same chip tile floors. Same flickering light above the check-in desk. Same faint smell of lemon cleaner and cafeteria soup. Marjorie met me near the elevators, her badge swinging gently from a red lanyard. She looked exactly the same, short silver curls, lipstick just a bit too bright, smile kind but sharp underneath. I brought you something, she said, holding up a folder. We found a corner booth in the old volunteer lounge, the same place Daryl and I used to wait during his blood work. She slid the folder across the table. Everything we have on his admission from February 2nd to the 12th. I opened it slowly. Progress notes. Vitals. Doctor sign-offs. He was transferred to inpatient oncology on the 10th. Marjorie explained. That means by the 12th he was already on morphine. High dose. I flipped to that page. Her finger tapped a line on the chart. SUA 12 patient nonverbal. Responds to pain stimuli. No capacity to sign documents. My chest tightened. Are you sure? She nodded. Legally, he couldn't consent to anything that day. But the deed, I whispered. The cabin transfer. It's dated 2/12. Marjorie sat back. Well, someone has a lot of explaining to do then. My fingers gripped the file tighter. He hadn't just been sick that day. He'd been unconscious. And yet somehow, his name appeared in blue ink on a property transfer that afternoon. I stared at the chart again, my mind racing. What else had Savannah handled while he was drifting in and out of consciousness? Marjorie leaned in. Eunice, do you remember which law office handled the papers? Matheson, I said. Downtown Chattanooga? She nodded slowly. I'm not saying anything official, she murmured. But if I were you, I'd ask if that building has hallway cameras, especially outside conference rooms. I blinked. You think she brought the papers there? Marjorie didn't answer directly. She just raised an eyebrow. I've seen a lot in 20 years, more than I care to repeat. But signatures like that, on days like that, they don't come from patience. I closed the file. Fingers trembling, not from age this time, but from something sharper. Conviction. I had spent weeks mourning quietly, swallowing words, folding grief into manageable corners. But now I felt it rising. Not anger, something older. More precise. A mother's memory. A nurse's instinct. A woman's refusal to be erased. I stood slowly. Thank you, Marjorie. I don't know what I would have done without you. She reached out, squeezed my hand. You'd have figured it out. Because Eunice Harlan doesn't let people steal what's hers. I walked into Matheson Law with my coat zipped and my mouth set. The receptionist smiled politely. Welcome back, Mrs. Harlan. Miss Erica's out today, but if you're here for copies, I can help. I actually had a small question about February 12th, I said lightly, just clarifying some things. Her brows pinched slightly. I wasn't working then, but let me see if someone from that day's staff is in. She disappeared through the frosted glass door. A few moments later, a young man in a wrinkled dress shirt appeared. Sandy hair, nervous smile. His name tag read Miles in turn. Ma'am, I was here in February, he said. Can I help? I leaned in, keeping my voice gentle. There was a document signed here, property transfer, Daryl Harlan. Do you remember if he came in that day? He blinked, then nodded slowly. Oh yeah, I remember that name. He scratched his cheek, thinking. Actually, I don't think he came in. The woman, Savannah, she showed up with all the paperwork. She was alone. He hesitated. Yeah. She said her husband was too sick to travel, but that he'd already signed. She just needed it notarized. My pulse thudded in my ears. She had the signed documents with her. Yup. She handed them over, asked for a quick stamp. Said they were in a hurry, something about prepping for hospice. I remember because she seemed rushed. I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded in front of me. Miles, thank you. That helps more than you know. He smiled again, oblivious. No problem. Hope everything works out. I walked back to my car slowly. The wind had picked up. Leaves skated across the sidewalk like they were running from something. Inside the car, I sat still. Hands on the steering wheel. Eyes on nothing. So that's how she did it. She brought the documents in. Already signed. Claimed he was too sick. Said all the right things in that calm, pleasant voice of hers. And they believed her. Because she was the wife. Because she looked clean. Because she knew how to smile like nothing was wrong. I reached into my bag and pulled out the birthday card again. Daryl's handwriting danced in soft loops. Says love you, Mom. Daryl's, I laid it next to the photocopy of the cabin deed. The difference was undeniable. One was real. The other performed. And now I knew for sure. He hadn't been in that building. He hadn't signed anything there. She had spoken for him, taken his pen, taken his voice, taken what was left of his will, and no one had questioned her. The invitation came through a group text. Family remembrance dinner this Saturday, 6 p.m. casual attire. Bring wine. No mention of Daryl's name. No photo. Just emojis and a poorly cropped flyer with balloons. I stared at the screen, unsure if I was supposed to laugh or cry. But I went, because some part of me still believed showing up mattered. The house was louder than I remembered. Kids running between chairs. Lawn chairs set up on the front porch like a barbecue. Someone had plugged in a Bluetooth speaker playing country pop. Savannah met me at the door. Her smile was tight, unreadable. She wore red lipstick and a jumpsuit far too festive for morning. Oh, good, you made it, she said, brushing past me. Can you help bring out the iced tea? I blinked. Aye, sure. In the kitchen, the dishwasher hummed. Cups clinked as I opened the cabinet, none of them matched. I found a pitcher of tea in the fridge. Poured it into a glass, then another. Savannah called out from the other room. Make sure you don't spill. The coasters are in the drawer? I froze. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was worse. Dismissive. Effortless. The way you speak to someone paid to serve you. I carried the tray out, balancing carefully. A few people nodded. No one stood. One woman I didn't recognize smiled vaguely. You're the aunt, right? Before I could answer, Savannah chimed in. No, that's Daryl's mother. She's retired now, keeps busy with church stuff. She likes helping. I stood there, tray in hand, heart cracking like old wood. She likes helping. As if that explained why I was pouring drinks at my own son's memorial. I placed the glasses on the table and turned back toward the kitchen. That's when I saw Emily. My granddaughter? 17. face serious, eyes steady, she was watching me. Not with pity, but with something sharper, something alert. She walked over quietly, touched my elbow. "Grandma," she said softly, "you don't have to do that." I smiled the way women do when they've learned to survive in public. "It's fine, sweetheart. Just trying to be useful." She didn't let go. "Mum's being a brat," she muttered. "You know that, right?" I blinked at her. Emily had always been observant, but never bold. "She's just under a lot of pressure," I whispered back. Emily folded her arms. "Doesn't give her the right to act like your staff." I wanted to hug her. Tell her she didn't know how much that meant. But I just nodded, gently squeezed her hand, and walked back toward the kitchen. I passed the hallway mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. Blouse slightly wrinkled, hair pulled back too tightly, a woman half faded, blurry at the edges. But then I thought of Emily's face. That fierce, quiet fury. Maybe I wasn't invisible after all. Dinner was served buffet-style, lasagna from a grocery tray, salad in a plastic bowl, store-brand dinner rolls that crumbled when touched. I sat near the window, a folding chair with a wobbly leg, my plate half full, mostly untouched. Across the room, Savannah raised a glass of rosé. "I just want to thank everyone for being here," she began, voice smooth and airy. "It's been a tough year, but we're finally settling. The cabin, especially, has brought so much peace to the kids." I looked up. "The cabin," she smiled toward the crowd. "Daryl and I always dreamed of having a retreat. It was our joint project. And I'm just so proud it's finally in the family." A few people clapped politely. One aunt even said, "You've handled things beautifully." "Dear," I felt my fork tremble in my hand. The cabin wasn't her project. It was Daryl's escape, and before that, mine and Daryl's. He carved his name into the back porch rail when he was 12. We painted the shutters together the summer he turned 20. Savannah had spent exactly 2 nights there in her life, one of them arguing over cell service. Now she was rewriting it, erasing what didn't fit. I caught myself gripping my napkin too tightly. "Let it go. Breathe." Emily sat quietly across the room, earbuds tucked into her hoodie. When Savannah wrapped up her toast with a smug smile, the room scattered again, back to dessert trays and card games in the den. I stood, carried my plate to the trash. On the way, someone bumped into me.
A light tap, intentional?
Emily. She didn't say anything. Just slipped a folded napkin into my hand. I waited until I reached the powder room to open it. Inside was a note. Written in blue ink, rushed but legible. "As meet me behind the garage after cake. Don't tell any name. No context." But I knew her handwriting. My heart beat faster, not from fear, from the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Momentum. I washed my hands slowly, fixed my collar in the mirror, held the paper like a lifeline. Back in the living room, Savannah was laughing too loud at something someone's cousin said. The cake was being cut. The same vanilla sheet cake they'd bought for Daryl's last birthday. Cheap, overly sweet, generic. Fitting, I didn't take a slice. I waited near the side door. When no one was looking, I stepped out into the night. The air was cooler than I expected. Quiet, with only the chirp of a single frog down near the ditch. Behind the garage, a porch light flickered. And then Emily appeared, hands in her sweatshirt pockets, eyes serious. "You okay, Grandma?" she asked.
I nodded.
"No," I said. "But I'm starting to be." Emily shuffled her feet against the gravel, eyes darting toward the garage light. "I shouldn't be out here long," she whispered. But I had to say something. I stepped closer. Her face looked older in the moonlight. Not aged, just aware. Like someone who'd seen too much too young. "What is it?" She hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. A folded page, lined notebook paper, torn at the edges. "I drew this back in February," she said. "Don't laugh. I was sketching the hospital hallway while Mom was in the room with Dad." I opened it slowly. A pencil sketch, loose lines, but clear. Savannah hunched over a bedside table, pen in hand, paper on her lap. Daryl's eyes were closed. He wasn't sitting up. He wasn't reaching for the pen. He looked gone. I stared at the drawing, heart suddenly heavy. "You were there?" I asked. I was supposed to be in the waiting room, but I snuck down the hallway. I wanted to say goodbye. Her voice cracked slightly. I was too late. I folded the drawing, hands trembling. The sketch was raw, half-finished in places, but it was more honest than any legal document I'd held in weeks. "Did you tell anyone?" She shook her head. "No one asked. They just said it was peaceful." Quick, like it didn't matter. The words hung between us. A truth no one had spoken aloud. She lowered her gaze. "I know I was just a kid," she said. But I saw her, forging something. I didn't know what at the time, but I knew it was wrong. My breath caught. She never looked up, Emily added. Just kept writing, flipping pages. She had a file folder on her lap. The image hit me like a stone. That room, that final day, that silence. Savannah always said she was doing her best. That grief made people act strangely. But she never grieved. Not once. I pressed my palm gently to Emily's cheek. You did the right thing telling me. She blinked fast. I hated how she talked to you tonight. Like you were some extra. I smiled, small and sad. She's been trying to erase me for a while now? Emily looked up. Then let's stop her. For a moment, I forgot the ache in my joints, the weight of grief. There under that flickering garage light, with the wind tugging at Emily's sleeves, I remembered who I used to be. A nurse, a mother, a woman who didn't back down. The world had changed since I buried Daryl. People talked faster, moved quicker, ignored more. But I still believed in truth. In holding the line, even if your hands shook doing it. You still have that sketchbook? I asked. She nodded. In my room. Don't let anyone take it. I won't. We stood in silence for a moment. Above us, a single star pierced the clouds, a sliver of stillness. Inside, the laughter continued. Another round of cake, another layer of lies. But out here, under this slice of sky, I had an ally, and that changed everything. The bank hadn't changed in decades. Same bell over the door, same burnt coffee smell in the corner, same security guard half asleep behind the desk. I stepped up to the teller window and asked for Rita. She's still here? I asked the young man. He nodded. Been here longer than the carpet. A few minutes later, she emerged from behind the frosted glass divider. Her hair was thinner, but her eyes were the same, sharp as fence wire and just as unyielding. Eunice Harland, she said, stepping around the desk. Haven't seen you since the scholarship fundraiser. I smiled softly. Long time. She led me into a side room, away from the hum of printers and muted keyboards. I laid the folder on the table. I need to ask you something. Quietly, Rita folded her hands. Go on. This account, I said, pointing to the statement. It was Daryl's. I helped him set it up years ago. Separate from Savannah. He wanted something just his, for emergencies. Rita nodded slowly. He trusted you. I thought so. Until I found out the balance dropped significantly the day before he passed. Her brow furrowed. She reached across, pulled the page closer. Withdrawal. December 2nd. 32,000. Oh, she paused. I was here that day. I held my breath. She tapped the corner of the document. I remember because she came in late. Almost closing. Said her husband was too ill to appear. My stomach turned. She had power of attorney. She did. Freshly notarized, she handed it over like it was a takeout receipt. Did she sign anything? Rita stood, crossed to a small filing drawer and pulled a manila envelope. She removed a form, slid it toward me. Signature box dated 12/2. Savannah's loops were perfect, too perfect. And above it, faint shaky, was Daryl's name, barely legible, off-center, unfamiliar. Rita leaned over, squinting. That's not the Daryl I remember. His signature had rhythm. This one looks like someone mimicked him while holding their breath. I felt a chill in my bones. You think it was forged? Rita didn't answer directly, but she didn't deny it either. She sat back down, sighing. I've seen a lot in this room. Folks scrambling after death like vultures. But what gets me was when the quiet ones get robbed while grieving. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she slid the paper back. I can print you a full activity log. No one has to know. My throat caught. Thank you, Rita. She shook her head. Don't thank me yet. Just promise me if something was taken from you, make sure it gets seen. I nodded slowly. I intend to. As I gathered my papers, I caught my reflection in the glass. Not angry, not broken. Focused inside me. Something was realigning. Not just suspicion, but truth. Not just hurt, but purpose. They thought I'd sit quietly, but I had names, dates, witnesses, and now receipts. And I planned to use every last one. I didn't sleep that night. Not a minute. I lay in bed, covers tucked to my chin, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan as it made lazy turns in the dark. The house creaked like it remembered better years. The refrigerator hummed with its usual defiance. And somewhere outside, a car door slammed, then silence. My fingers clutched the hem of the sheet. The visit with Rita had drained me, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't tired. I was awake in the oldest sense of the word. Aware, sharp-edged. I rolled onto my side and stared at the old cedar chest near the foot of the bed. It had been Daryl's favorite. When he was a boy, he'd hide comic books in it, As a teen, it held his baseball glove, his secret candy stash. After he left home, it became mine again. I used it for keepsakes, birthday cards, old receipts, newspaper clippings. I kicked off the blanket and padded across the room. The floor was cold. Each step reminded me I was no longer young, but I was still steady. I opened the chest. The smell of lavender and thyme hit me like a quiet gust. There, under a stack of church programs, was a small metal box. Green tin rusted at the corners. I brought it to the bed. Inside were letters, dozens, but one sat at the top, folded in thirds. The envelope read, "Mom, 2016 birthday." I hadn't opened it in years. I slid it free, unfolded the creased paper. If you're reading this, I'm probably still bossy and stubborn, but I hope I'm also still proud of you. You taught me to fight fair, to speak up when something feels wrong. Don't let anyone corner you, Mom. Not ever. I love you. I read it twice, 3 times. By the 4th, the words blurred. Don't let anyone corner you. He had known even then. Even before Savannah became a shadow draped in silk, I looked around the room. The soft hum of the streetlight leaked through the blinds. My glass of water was half full. A single winter sock lay forgotten at the foot of the bed, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the future shifting. I opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand. Tucked inside was the deed folder from the cabin, still in its original envelope. Postmarked 3 days before Daryl was admitted to the hospital. I pulled it out, held it under the lamplight. His signature looked different than the one from December 2nd. Clearer, wider spacing, less pressure on the pen. I closed my eyes. Comparison was no longer a suspicion. It was proof waiting to be arranged, and I was ready to arrange it. I reached for the manila envelope beneath. The county records file. It was time to dig deeper. By 8:15 a.m., I was already dressed. Hair-pinned, blouse buttoned, folder in hand. The snow hadn't started yet, but the sky hung heavy, gray and swollen like it was holding its breath. I made coffee but barely drank it. Too bitter. Or maybe I just didn't want comfort this morning. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for the Douglas County Recorder's office. I found a number called. After 3 rings, a bright voice answered. "County Records, Kyle speaking." I took a breath. "Hi, Kyle. I'm trying to confirm the last update made to a deed. It's regarding a property near Middle Pine Lake. Address ends in 29B. He paused, typing.
Yes, ma'am.
That update was processed December 4th, 2 days after Daryl died. And who submitted it? He hesitated. Let me check the scanned documents. The silence stretched. Paper shuffled. Keyboard clicked. Finally, Kyle returned. The form was filed under Savannah Harland. Said she was acting under power of attorney. My grip on the phone tightened. Did it include a copy of the power? Yes, it's attached here. Stamped, but He trailed off. Huh? I prompted. I'm just noticing the notary code listed doesn't match our registry. It might have been a traveling notary, or an error. Happens sometimes. Does it happen often? I asked. He chuckled, unsure. Not usually. Want me to email you a scanned copy? Yes, please. Full record if possible. He took my email. Said the files would arrive within the hour. I hung up and set the phone down slowly. Something inside me pulsed steady and clear. I wasn't chasing shadows anymore. This was real. Lines didn't match. Dates didn't align. Codes didn't exist. They thought I wouldn't look. That I'd be too broken to question. But grief and silence don't always go hand in hand. Sometimes, silence is just breath before thunder. I went to the desk drawer and pulled out my notebook. The yellow one I used when I handled estate claims at church. I flipped to a clean page. Wrote one word at the top. Discrepancy is under it. I listed bank withdrawal deck C2 cabin deed update deck 4 notary code mismatch sketch Feb. Emily witness signature comparison 2 styles. The page looked like nothing at first glance. But to me it was the beginning of an answer. I circled notary code twice. That would be my next call. Then I sat back in the chair. Outside, a bird landed on the icy rail, fluffed itself, and flew off again. They could take a lot from me. Time. Legacy. Even Daryl. But they couldn't take the truth, and I was getting closer. I didn't call ahead. Some things are better handled in person. The building was the same. Sandstone walls. Brass plaques dulled with time. Daryl's old law office. He had practiced there for 6 years before switching to consulting. He once said the office smelled like cologne and politics. I stepped into the waiting room. Cool air. Soft jazz playing. A receptionist with red glasses looked up. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Langdon." "Tell him it's Eunice Harland, Daryl's mother." She blinked, then nodded. "Let me check." Minutes later, I was ushered into a corner office with books lining every wall. Langdon stood to greet me. His hands were thinner than I remembered. "Eunice," he said warmly. "I'm so sorry." "Daryl was?" I raised a palm. "I'm not here for condolences." He nodded gently. I sat down and opened my leather folder. Inside Daryl's handwritten letter from 2020, the original deed, and a notarized joint ownership form he'd filed before Savannah ever touched that cabin. I laid each one out on the desk. "I want the cabin returned to my name. Quietly, no calls, no warnings." Langdon studied the papers in silence. His finger traced Daryl's signature. "Did you know he asked me to update his estate plan 6 months ago?" he said softly. "He never finished it. Got busy? Or distracted?" I said nothing. Langdon tapped the notarized form. This is valid, and stronger than what Savannah filed." He slid the papers back toward me. "I can file a petition to reinstate your ownership. You'll need to sign one affidavit. We can submit it today. The county typically turns it around in 72 hours. I exhaled slowly. "That's all I need?" "No notification?" he asked. "None." Langdon smiled faintly. "I always liked your kind of justice, Eunice. Quiet, but sharp." As I left the office, the receptionist offered me a peppermint from a glass bowl. I took one, unwrapped it, let it rest on my tongue. Sweet sharp, exactly like the days to come. The next morning, I went to the bank, not the small branch near my house, but the downtown office, the one with glass walls and tighter protocols. I dressed neatly. Dark coat, neutral scarf, hair pulled back tight. Inside, everything smelled like lemon polish and printer ink. A young woman greeted me at the welcome desk. "How can I help you today?" I handed her the folder. "I'm here regarding an estate matter. I'd like to speak with someone from Fiduciary Services." She nodded and led me to a side room. Minutes later, a woman named Clarissa entered. Gray blazer, thin smile, no nonsense. "I'm Eunice Harland," I began. "My son Daryl Harland passed earlier this month. I'm listed as a secondary on one of his private accounts." She opened the file, read silently, then looked up. "You're the listed beneficiary, yes? He named me as successor custodian in 2020. I also have this." I slid the letter forward. Daryl's writing, deliberate and dated, confirming the account was intended for my care if anything ever happened. Clarissa reviewed it. "This meets our threshold." She typed for several minutes, then looked at me. "I can place the account in restricted status until probate is settled. That means no further withdrawals or access unless authorized by court or the primary custodian. That's you." I nodded. "Do it." She paused. "Would you like us to notify the other party involved?" I didn't blink. "No. Let her find out the same way I did." Clarissa gave a slow nod. "I'll flag it immediately." I stood gathering my things. "Thank you," I said. Outside, the wind had picked up, cold direct. As I walked back to my car, I passed a mother and daughter holding hands, laughing about snowflakes on eyelashes. I didn't feel sad. I felt ready. 2 nights later, I sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand. The house was silent again. No clocks ticking, no wind this time. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator, the kind of quiet that asks if you're really ready. A cup of tea cooled beside me, untouched. The letter I was writing wasn't for anyone specific. Just a record. Of choices, of what dignity looked like when no one was watching. I had written 3 paragraphs when I heard a soft step in the hallway. "Emily." She paused in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head, pulling her robe tighter around her. "Then are you doing something, Grandma?" Her voice wasn't accusing. It was curious, hopeful even. I put down the pen. "Why do you ask?" She shrugged. "You've been calmer, but more focused, like you're putting puzzle pieces together. And yesterday, Mom was looking for something in Dad's desk and muttered, 'Why is everything locked up?' I met her eyes. Emily wasn't a child anymore. She saw. She listened. And she remembered things adults hoped she'd forget. I considered answering. The truth pulsed behind my ribs. But some things, they lose power when spoken too early, so I reached for her hand instead. "Sometimes healing," I said slowly, "begins with quiet decisions." She held my gaze a moment longer, then nodded. "I believe that." She turned and walked back to her room. I watched until the hallway light clicked off, then picked up the pen again. My hand moved slower now, but each letter felt deliberate. On the next line, I wrote, "No one has to know you're reclaiming your life, only that you did." I underlined it once, then folded the page gently, slid it into the envelope. Mark F. Cabin file, private outside. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, relentless. And inside, so had my resolve. The letter came at 9:12 a.m. stamped, official, crisp. I'd been watching the mailbox through the kitchen blinds all morning, not with anxiety, but with quiet clarity. Like someone waiting for the final puzzle piece. The mailman didn't even knock, just slid the envelope in, unaware he'd just delivered a storm. I opened it with steady hands. Reinstatement of property title Eunice Harland approved. Effective immediately. The cabin was mine again. Not as a favor, not as a memory. As fact, I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into a red file marked Final. I didn't get to enjoy the silence long. A loud knock rattled the front door. Then another. I walked slowly across the carpet, heart calm, fingers steady. The kind of steadiness that doesn't come from peace, but from knowing exactly what's real. When I opened it, Savannah stood there, coat unzipped, cheeks flushed, eyes blazing. "You closed Daryl's account!" Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass, and louder than it needed to be. I said nothing. "I went to transfer funds this morning, and the clerk told me access was restricted." "What did you do?" She stepped forward, but I didn't move back. "I just tilted my head. You know," I said softly. "For weeks I asked you questions, quietly, respectfully. You smiled, changed the subject, or just lied." Her mouth opened to respond, but I held up a finger. "Now it's my turn to say nothing?" She blinked. "You have no right." "I have every right," I interrupted, "and more documentation than you." I turned and walked back into the living room, left the door open. She followed, fuming. The sound of her boots on the hardwood echoed like judgment. On the table, a neat stack of folders, color-coded, labeled, bank statements, signed affidavits, a printed scan of Daryl's original deed. I didn't raise my voice, didn't point or shout. I simply opened the red file and pulled out the letter that had arrived not 10 minutes before. I held it out. She didn't take it, just stared at it like it was poison, like she could smell her own downfall. "This is absurd." "No," I said. "This is legal." The silence that followed was thick and uneven. Savannah's lips parted, but no words came. I watched her shoulders rise then fall. The fight in her eyes flickered, just briefly. Then I turned, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled one last envelope from the top shelf. The one marked in boldsy, just in case. I placed it gently on the table. "You might want to sit down." I slid the envelope toward her. She hesitated, then snatched it up like it might explode. Inside, a 2-page letter on bank letterhead, dated 3 days ago, signed by Rita Wexler. Savannah skimmed the first lines, brow furrowing. She paused at the paragraph comparing the 2 signatures. "This doesn't prove anything," she muttered. I stayed quiet. Let the stillness of the room do what my voice didn't need to. She turned to the second page, a scan of Daryl's original signature from 2020. Below it, a shaky, inconsistent version used on the December 2nd withdrawal. The difference was stark. Spacing, stroke pressure, pen angle. It wasn't just questionable. It was obvious. "This is taken out of context," Savannah said louder, the corner of the page trembling in her hand. "He was ill. He was in pain. That's why it looks different." I took a breath. Not out of fatigue, but restraint. He was already unconscious, Savannah. The ICU log confirms it. She flinched, subtle. But there, still she straightened. "You're twisting this. He wanted me to have control. That was his wish." She said it like she needed to believe it more than I needed to disprove it. And then, footsteps creaked on the stairs. Emily appeared at the base of the steps, arms folded over her chest. "I saw what you did that night." Savannah turned. Emily's voice was soft, almost too soft. "I was awake. You didn't know I was in the hallway, but I saw you come downstairs with his file. You had gloves on." The room cracked open with silence. Savannah's mouth moved, but no sound came. "I didn't understand it then," Emily added. "But I do now." Her eyes didn't leave Savannah. It wasn't anger in her tone. It was clarity, like fog had finally lifted and revealed something you never wanted to see. Savannah's fingers tightened around the paper. Her face was pale now, not with guilt, but exposure. For a moment, she looked at me, like maybe she could still explain, still charm her way through. But I didn't offer a lifeline, and neither did Emily. We just waited, and in that waiting she shrank. Savannah stood frozen, the paper wilting in her grip. Emily didn't blink. I didn't move. Seconds passed, maybe 30, maybe 3, before Savannah finally broke the silence. "You've always hated me?" Her voice cracked. "Too brittle to be venom?" I looked at her. "I didn't hate you. I hoped you'd grow." She scoffed. "He always pitied you, you know. He felt sorry for the life you wasted staying small, staying safe. I didn't flinch. Not because it didn't sting, but because it came from someone who no longer mattered. I stepped closer just once and said quietly, "There's a difference between small and still. Stillness listens. Stillness sees." That's how I knew. Savannah's face twisted, searching for one last shred of control, but there was nothing left for her to hold. "I'll fight at it," she hissed. "Lawyers, courts, I'll burn it all." "No," I said softly. "You won't." Emily walked to my side, her hand brushing mine, steady, calm. "You won't," I repeated, "because you know deep down you already lost." Savannah's breath caught. Then she turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard the windows trembled. The room held its breath. I didn't speak, I just exhaled. Emily looked up at me.
That was a lot?
I nodded. "Go put on your shoes," I said gently. "We've got one more thing to do." Outside, the cold had softened. The clouds were thinning. Sunlight slicked between branches like forgiveness through stubborn trees. We drove across town in silence. At the legal annex, a notary named Mr. Jensen met us on the steps. Kind eyes. No small talk. He reviewed the updated documents, checked signatures, dates, attached the letter from the county. Then he turned to Emily. "You're here as a witness." She nodded. "I am." He handed me the pen. My fingers didn't shake, I signed. He pressed the red seal onto the page, firm and final. The sound it made, soft, clean, absolute, filled the quiet. Legacy restored, not loud, not celebrated, but mine. And this time no one would take it again. The house felt heavier after silence returned. Not oppressive, just full. Full of the kind of stillness that lingers after war. The kind where furniture feels like witnesses and rugs hold secrets. I spent the morning cleaning. Not because it was dirty, but because my hands needed something to do while my heart recalibrated. I dusted the tops of bookshelves, even the ones I couldn't reach without the step stool. Wiped picture frames I hadn't touched in years. Each photo held a different kind of ache. Daryl in college, me holding him in the hospital blanket. Even one of Henry, back when his eyes still looked toward family instead of legacy. I boxed some of them away, not to forget, but to make space. The phone rang once around noon. I saw Henry's name flash on the screen. I let it ring. Then ring again an hour later. I didn't block the number. I just didn't pick up. Some calls don't need answering. Some people don't get a third chance. By 3 p.m., the sun had started to cast long shadows across the carpet. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. The cabin road was quiet, the snow packed soft underfoot. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't checking for footprints. Wasn't looking over my shoulder, just walking, letting the cold air scrub the noise from my lungs. As I neared the edge of the lake, I saw the bench, old wood, moss on one side, and there, resting on the slats, a pair of gloves. Brown leather. Worn, familiar Daryl's. I hadn't seen them in over a year. Didn't even know he'd left them out here. I sat down beside them, didn't touch them, just looked. The lake was half frozen, crusted in early March ice. A few ducks stood awkward on the edge, waiting for spring. Everything waited. That's what grief was. Sometimes, not tears or screams, just waiting. I breathed in. Pine, cold mud, old leather, and something softer, something like permission. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. But I stayed. Long enough for the cold to seep in, long enough to let go just a little. I didn't hear her footsteps. Only the sound of snow crunching once she was already near. Emily sat beside me without a word. Like she belonged there? Like she'd always known how to find me when I needed quiet. She glanced at the gloves, then back at the lake. "I used to think this place was boring," she said, her voice low, like it was stuck in time. I smiled faintly. "It is stuck. That's the beauty of it." She laughed once, dry but warm. A gust of wind picked up, sending fine ice crystals dancing through the air. We sat like that for a while, no need to fill the silence. Some relationships grow stronger in the stillness. Then she turned to me. "Grandma, bless. What if we opened it back up?" I looked at her, brow raised. "The cabin," she clarified. "What if it didn't just sit here locked and closed and quiet?" I didn't respond immediately. She continued. "People like you, women like you, they don't get places like this. Not without strings. Not without judgment. What if we gave them something else? A place to land. Just for a while." Her words settled over me like a blanket. "Warm. Heavy. Familiar. I'm not sure I'm ready for that," I said almost to myself. She nodded. "You don't have to be. Not all at once." She looked out at the lake again. "But maybe someday. A place for people to remember who they are before the world told them otherwise." I reached down, fingers brushing the edge of Daryl's gloves. The leather was cold, cracked in the seams, but still whole, like me. "You're not like your mother?" I said softly. Emily didn't flinch. "I know, and that's a gift." She said nothing, but her hand found mine, held it. Not tight, not rushed. Just enough. We stayed there as the light began to fade. Cabin behind us. Lake ahead and something between us, a question not quite answered. A promise not yet made. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. Sometimes healing starts with the smallest of agreements. A shared silence, a steady hand, a pair of gloves left behind and finally picked up. The boxes didn't take long to unpack. I hadn't brought much. A few sweaters, 3 framed photos, and the red folder marked final. Everything else I left behind. What didn't serve me anymore didn't deserve the space. The cabin was colder than I remembered, but honest. The kind of cold that wakes you up, not drives you away. I lit the fireplace the first night. The sound of wood cracking, the smell of old pine. It settled something in me. The next morning I found the right spot. A bare patch of wall above the small bookshelf. I hung the gloves there. Daryl's gloves. Not for decoration, not for sentiment, just as a reminder. That something left behind can still mean something. I stood back and looked. They looked right there. Like they'd always belonged. The sun poured through the window, hitting the wood grain in golden stripes. I made a cup of tea and sat at the table with a fresh notebook. The first page blank. I stared at it a while before writing thus. To the woman who was told she takes up too much space, or not enough. This place is yours too. The pen moved slowly. No flourish, no grand declarations. Just a note from one kind of survivor to another. If you've ever been called too loud, too soft, too needy, too old, there's room here. For you. Just as you are. I paused, letting the words breathe. Outside, the lake shimmered like quiet applause. Emily would be back next weekend. She promised to bring paint samples and a name for the cabin program. I didn't care what she called it, as long as it meant something to someone someday. I signed the bottom. E. Harland folded the page, slipped it into the blue envelope, pinned it beside the gloves. Some people leave monuments, some leave money. I left a pair of gloves, a few words, and a cabin with the door slightly open. 1 year later, the cabin smelled like lemon oil and lavender soap. 12 women had come through. Not all at once, just one at a time. Each stayed for a week, some cried. Some slept for days. Some left books behind with notes in the margins. All of them thanked me. But I never said, "You're welcome." I just said, "Take what you need." Emily handled the paperwork, the meal planning, the website I still hadn't quite figured out. She gave the cabin a name. A Cars, the quiet house. I didn't argue it fit. This morning, I sat in the rocker on the front porch, wrapped in a flannel blanket. The lake was thawing again. Patches of sunlight shimmered like tiny invitations. A new guest was due at noon. I didn't ask what she'd been through. I never did. It wasn't about the details. It was about the silence people weren't allowed to have elsewhere. Emily stepped onto the porch with her clipboard. "She's coming from St. Louis," she said.
Widow.
Former school principal?
I nodded.
"She'll do fine," I said. "She'll be nervous," Emily added. "They always are." A soft breeze lifted the corner of the welcome mat. The gloves still hung inside, a little more worn now. I didn't mind. Things should age when they're loved. Emily sat beside me. The kind of silence we shared now was different from before. Not heavy, not full of what-ifs, just easy. She pulled out a notebook. "We're getting requests for fall," she said. "Should we open more spots?" I didn't answer right away, just watched a bird land near the steps. Small, unbothered. Finally I said, "We'll see." She smiled. That was enough. The sound of a car crunching gravel came up the drive. Emily stood. I stayed seated. The woman who stepped out was maybe 65, hair tied back, eyes uncertain, but not dim. She carried a single suitcase and a folded piece of paper. She paused when she saw me. I gave a little wave. She waved back. Emily moved to greet her. I stayed in the chair, watched them walk inside, heard the front door open, then close.
I looked out at the lake.
And I whispered, as if not invisible anymore. Some stories end with a bang. Mine ended with a door closing gently and another quietly opening. I didn't get revenge in the way people expect. No lawsuits. No screaming matches, just truth, documentation, and time. But more than that, I reclaimed something people thought I'd lost my worth. Not in how loud I fought, but in how still I stood. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt dismissed, invisible, replaced, know this: you are not too old. Not too late. Not too much. You are the beginning of something quiet and beautiful. A new chapter no one else gets to write. I never planned to run a cabin for women. But maybe healing begins when we stop planning and start listening to the part of us we buried just to keep the peace. So here's my question for you. Plus, what would you do if no one was watching, and who would you become if you finally stopped apologizing? Think about it.
Then tell me.
Not for me, for the next woman waiting for her story to begin.